But let's look at an example that Dan McClellan gave, because this is a wild one.
And so this is the beginning of Isaiah 53, and I've underlined in red all the meaning differences that have to be represented in translation. And then here is the rest of Isaiah 53 with those meaning differences highlighted.
All right, now, Ruslan over at God Bless Studios, he took a look at this claim from Dan. He enlarged the image to really take a look at what Dan was pointing out of the variants of Isaiah 53. He found some interesting things in that. Let's check it out.
But it's very interesting that when we looked at Dan's initial response to Wes, we found that his own screen grab showed variants that seemed extremely inconsequential. So here is from Dan's original video, some of these variants, okay? Now they're underlined, and if you look closely, it says the word and, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There seems to be about a dozen variants, and 5 of those variants is the word and. Now we all have to come to our own conclusion. These variants that are significant, are these significant variants if the word and is in here 5 times, but the other words are things like whom, look at him? Are these significant variants? Are these significant things that change the text, change the meaning of the text, change the application of the text, change anything about the reliability of the scripture? I think people have to do their own diligence and work through that. But these are the type of variants that Dan himself highlights. These are the type of variants that no one goes on to explain in any of these videos. And I would love for Dan or Alex to go and tell us, how does this change the actual meaning of the passage? How different is this?
Ooh, pick me! I want to explain this to Ruslan.
Oh, pick me! Oh, I know, me!
No, legitimately. If somebody could pass this video off to him, I would love for him to see, if nothing else than just this part of this video. Because he has no idea how right he is. And yes, I will use the word shocked. Ruslan will be shocked when he sees the Hebrew implications of this addition of the word and. Hebrew does not have a word for and. I'll let that just sit a moment. Hebrew does not have a word for and. So how do they communicate a conjunction? They do have a way, but it's not through a word. Hebrew uses a prefix of vav before a word to communicate a conjunction. What's a prefix? A prefix is a small addition at the beginning of a word to slightly change its meaning. Let's consider the prefix re in English. If you consider the difference between to build something versus to rebuild something. Re is a prefix which means to do again. So rebuild, redo, refill, reload. Re alters the meanings of these words to communicate that it's being done again. So vav is another prefix, and it means and. It's not a separate word. It's a prefix only. So what does that mean? Well, technically, whenever a manuscript adds the word and, they're not adding a word. It's still the exact same word. It's just getting an extension at the beginning of it. So these 5 variations in Isaiah 53 where it adds the word and, those wouldn't technically affect the word for word thing that Wes said. But that's just a general usage of the vav prefix as a conjugate. But the vav functions more than just a conjugate in Hebrew. Google's AI has a really good interpretation of this. It says, the vav conjugation in Hebrew is a prefix that is used to join words, phrases, or clauses. It is spelled with the letter vav. The vav conjunction can be used to mean and, or, but, now, or then. Now, the specific usage in this case of Isaiah 53 is not a conjugate. It's something that's unique to Hebrew called the vav consecutive. You can see it down here in this AI translation. The vav consecutive is used in biblical Hebrew to prefix verbs in a continued narration. It's in a continued narration. So let's look at one of these examples that Dan McClellan gave. This is without the vav and. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Note that this sentence has 2 ands in it. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But none of those are the vav in question for this variation. The vav in question is added. He was despised and forsaken of men, and a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Notice how small that difference is. It literally does not change the meaning at all. It's even smaller in Hebrew. So what's the purpose of it? It is a grammatical structure in Hebrew. Google's AI describing the Vav consecutive as a continued narration is a good interpretation of this. It's just smoothing out the flow of the phrase. It's a slight Hebrew expression to tie two thoughts together as natural outpourings of one another. I think the best way I can articulate what this Vav is doing, translating it into English, would be something so subtle I cannot pronunciate the difference, so I'll just actually show you the difference. This is without the Vav conjugate. He was despised and forsaken of men, semicolon, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This would be my interpretation with the Vav consecutive. He was despised and forsaken of men, comma, dash, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Debatably, this hardly affects the word for word at all. Debatably, this hardly affects the meaning at all. So I don't think this should count against the word for word. Obviously, it is still a variation, but again, it's just showing how small, how petty these 2,600 variations are. Dan considered this a major variation that changes the meaning of it. What's the meaning change? Practically none. So slight of a meaning change that when you translate into English, really the best way to articulate it is only in the punctuation. So in editing this video, I wanted to double check some things on the Hebrew between the 1Q Isaiah and the Masoretic, specifically on this Isaiah 53 passage. So I looked up trying to find it, and I was hoping to find it in Hebrew, but I was only able to find stuff that had it in English, which has some translation problems, but this site I did find some interesting things on. So this site here, it shows in green here, words that are spelled different. So here, words present in this scroll but with spelling difference that do not affect meaning are in green like this. However, red is what's actual word difference is. So the Masoretic is red with a strike through, and the Dead Sea Scroll is red with a line underneath it. So anyway, when we look at this and compare it to what Dan said are more than just spelling variations, we find some interesting things. So if we look at Dan's here, who has believed our message and to whom, more than just a spelling variation. Whereas here we see who has believed our message in green. Dan did not include that, but to whom in green, which Dan did include that one as more than a spelling variant. But this site says it is just a spelling variant, just in green. If we go on, he had no majesty, that we should look at him. Red, which means more than a spelling variant. He had no good looks or majesty, green, which means just spelling variant. That we should see him, green, that means just spelling variant. Which, by the way, this is why I wanted Hebrew, because obviously Dan's source is translated to English different from this source that I'm looking at, which is why it's different in this, but that's just translation, so that's not the actual sources themselves. Anyway, the point being, as we can see here, these variations that Dan is saying is more than just spelling variations. This site here is just saying that they are only spelling variations. So what's up with that? There are only 3 here that are not just spelling variations that are in red. See, you can see down here the and. This is a Vav consecutive that we looked at. He was despised and rejected by men and a man of suffering and acquainted with disease. This is what we looked at already. It's a Vav consecutive. It's a prefix. It's not a word. But that's the only one in this entire page. This entire page that Dan is saying is more than spelling variations. Only one of them on Dan's more than spelling variations appears as more than just a spelling variation on this. And that one is the Vav consecutive and, which isn't even a word. It's a prefix in Hebrew. On the second page that Dan's got, we've got, again, just another Vav consecutive. As a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silenced, so he did not open his mouth. Again, the Vav consecutive, exact same thing as what we looked at with the previous one. There's one more, down here on verse 9. They made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man, in the Masoretic Text, in his death. In the 1Q Isaiah A, they made his grave with the wicked, and with rich people, in his death. So it changes from a rich man to rich people. Now here's the thing about this one is most ancient languages like Hebrew, and which is why I wish I could see the Hebrew instead of the English translation, quite often men can get translated as people, right? Because men means 2 things. Men can mean just males, or men can mean humans, including females. So this translation, it could just be a singular plural difference. That could be the only difference. And this is all of the variations in Isaiah 53. According to Dan's standard, that is more than just spelling differences. This site here has every single one of them as just spelling variations. Dan says that all these are more than spelling variations, But the only 3 on here that are more than just spelling variations is 2 Vav consecutives, prefixes of and 1 word changed from singular to plural. That's it.